Welcome to the Shipping Podcast, where you meet interesting maritime professionals sharing their passion for the shipping industry and their everyday job. I am your host. My name is Lena Gothberg. Welcome to the 50th episode of the Shipping Podcast, and Happy New Year 2017. Today we're going to meet Peter Hinchliffe, who is the Secretary General of the ICS, that is the International Chamber of Shipping, which is the association that is gathering all the shipowners associations around the world. Before we start, I would like to point out that I made this interview with Peter in London, in his office, on July the 12th. That is important because so many things have happened since then. We are referring a lot to the Ballast Water Management Convention. And if you're interested in the technical sides of ballast water, I suggest that you go to the 29th episode and listen to Niklas Dahl. He knows more or less all about ballast water management. The convention stipulates that it will enter into force 12 months after ratification by a minimum of 30 states, representing 35% of the world merchant shipping tonnage. Late August 2016, Finland was the 30th country to ratify the convention, so it will come into full force and effect on the 8th of September 2017. That we didn't know when I was speaking to Peter. Secondly, Peter is also referring to the US Coast Guard and their requirements. The United States has not ratified the convention, they usually don't. So they got their own requirements. But on December the 2nd, 2016, the US Coast Guard Marine Safety Center issued the first US Coast Guard Ballast Water Management System type approval certificate, and they approved an ultraviolet system. If this doesn't make any sense to you at this stage, it will once you have listened to Peter. I just don't want him to sound like these things never happened, because they did. And my wish is that the government people, both within and without the maritime domain, was listening to this episode, because I think it's very good to know all the things that Peter is talking about, how the system works and how it doesn't work. But without further ado, this is Peter Hinchliffe for you. Welcome to the Shipping Podcast.
Thank you.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Peter Hinchliffe. I'm the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Shipping in London.
And how did you start in shipping?
When I was 8 years old, I decided that I wanted to run away to sea. But I waited until I was 18 and finished my secondary education, and then went and joined the Royal Navy in the UK. And I stayed there for 27 years, mostly in the submarine service. So I qualified as a submariner, spent 20 years in submarines, and the last 5 of those years I was in command of 3 different submarines. And then at the end of that time I thought, actually I need a new challenge now, because I could see that all I was going to do for the rest of my career in the Navy was sit at a desk somewhere in the Ministry of Defence. And that didn't appeal to me at all, so I decided to leave. And just by sheer chance, I saw an advert for ICS, about which I knew nothing. But it was the most appealing advert that I had seen, so I applied, and Chris Horrocks was kind enough to offer me a job. And slowly over the years, since 2001, I've worked my way up to be Secretary General, and I've been Secretary General since 2010.
What did you do when you first came?
In ICS, I started out in the Marine Department as a Marine advisor. And then after a few years, I became the head of the Marine Department. And then from there, I became Secretary General.
Could you explain what does the Chamber of Shipping do? What is your job and what role do you play?
Yes, the role of ICS is to represent the views of ship owners from all over the world. Our members are not individual shipping companies. They are national shipowner associations. And they join us because they obviously have a very good relationship with their individual administration, their government. But they don't have a seat at the International Maritime Organization. And so what we do is we bring together the 37 countries we have in our membership. They all share their views, and we thrash out their views until eventually we get to a consensus position which everybody in the membership can live with. And then it's the role of ICS to take that view to the International Maritime Organization or the International Labour Organization. Those are the two primary UN agencies that we work with. But we also have an observer seat in many other UN agencies and can go to the UN itself if needs be. And in fact, we spent quite a lot of time at the UN when we were dealing with the emergence of piracy in the Indian Ocean, when the UN itself got involved. But mostly we're working with the specialist agencies underneath the UN.
Is there anyone who is not a National Shipowners Association?
Yes, we do have an associate membership level, and really there are two categories of people who sit in that. One is national associations who are not the prime association for the industry in their country. So, for example, in Australia, we have two members. What is now called Marine Industry Association Limited of Australia is the main one. That's our full member. And Shipping Australia is an associate member, because they have a slightly different membership base and a slightly different relationship with the government. The same is true in Canada. So that's one category. The other category of associate member is a company that, for one reason or another, doesn't have a particular national association, or perhaps in their country there is no national association, so they might come to us direct. But actually, these days we only have two companies in the membership like that. But all of the full members, the 37 full members, are the key national association in their country.
So maybe a stupid question, but why only 37 countries?
Well, that 37 gives us more than 80% of the world's tonnage, because although there's 190 odd countries in the United Nations, they're not all ship-owning nations. In fact, some of them, of course, don't even have sea borders. So those 37 countries are the key ship-owning nations, and that's why they come to us. There are one or two other countries who'd like to get in, and we obviously try to have a relationship with them. But usually, by implication of what I've already said, they tend to be quite small. So their revenue from their own members within the country is quite small, and they find our membership fee a little bit daunting. Although we do charge a membership fee based on the tonnage that they have in their membership. So that's one role of ICS. And I guess there are two others. One really important role is that we also produce publications, many of which are industry standard publications. And some of them, when we're really lucky, they're actually mandated as carriage requirements on ships by some administrations. So that actually a very large proportion of our revenue stream comes from producing these publications. And then I guess the third element is just generally representing the industry and our members in all sorts of fora all around the world, on the conference circuit or in meetings with governments, either individually or collectively.
So how many people work here in this building?
Only 20.
Only 20? Wow.
So our staff is 21 actually, 20 in the UK, and one legal director who works in Australia.
Governing the world. Oh, I see.
I wouldn't say we're governing the world. I hope that we're quite successful at influencing governments and regulators on the best way to solve whatever problem it is they're trying to solve by regulating shipping. And our focus is always not so much to say, no, don't do this regulation. Our focus is much more to look at what is the objective that they're trying to achieve. Can we achieve that objective in a way which is cost effective for the industry, that doesn't overlap with existing regulation, whose impact is known, and for which there will be no unforeseen circumstances. But as history shows, we're not always totally successful in achieving that. What I do think we have done over the years is that we have been able to influence regulation sufficiently that we probably saved the industry quite a lot of money, although owners listening to this will be quite surprised by that, because some of the bills that regulation has thrown up recently have been, frankly, horrendous. But I always say, yes, but it would have been much worse if ICS hadn't been there.
Of course. That's your job to say that, isn't it?
Well, it's my job, but actually I believe it passionately as well. I genuinely think we make a difference. I don't think it would be worth getting up in the morning to do this work unless I knew that we were achieving something day by day. And I genuinely think that we do make a difference.
So what did your parents say when you were wanting to run away at 8 years old?
Well, I never threatened to actually run away, although I just decided that's what I wanted to do. And I was quite content to carry on with my education. But I was doing a lot of sailing, so I got into sailing at about the age of, actually about 10 probably. So I satisfied some of my desire to be associated with water at that stage. But actually they were quite happy, and originally my plan was to join the Merchant Navy, and I would have been following my grandfather's footsteps in doing that, because he'd been in a very famous UK-based shipping company, not for his whole career, but for some of it. So there was, they already knew there was that kind of legacy to follow up on, and they were quite happy. I think they were happy that I was focused on finding some work. That was probably their prime feeling, I think.
So it's fair to say that you've been around for a while in the shipping industry. What are the biggest changes that you have seen?
That's a really difficult question, because, of course, I have to be blunt and honest and say I wasn't in merchant shipping until 15 years ago. So I can really, I've seen, having watched a lot of ships through the periscope, and I think submariners are naturally ship spotters, and I think we're quite proud of watching ships. So I've seen changes, in design. I've seen changes in size. I've seen changes in the size of companies, the growth of big companies, which is a process which is still going on at the moment. And in my time here, of course, I've seen changes that have been brought about probably more by regulation than by commercial pressure. And so, some of the good regulation, like increasing the efficiency of ships, which we're still working on, I think has been very good. It's good for the industry because it does save owners money ultimately, although it's a difficult step to take, that you have to spend money in order to save money ultimately. But I think, by and large, most of the regulatory changes have actually been helpful.
Yeah, I can see that the regulations on SECA, sulfur, in the part where I'm from, has spurred people to be innovative. I see new things every day, more or less. People are thinking outside the box more than inside the box. Okay. So in a way, I think you're right, but it has costed a lot of money. And of course, the ship owners within the SECA area still think that it's not a level playing field.
Yeah, I think the SECA was a very interesting change in the way that regulation is done. It was the first time that a regulation was introduced that imposed an ongoing cost. Up until that point, regulation had been, okay, you have to have a new box on board your ship and it's going to cost you X $1,000. In this case, of course, if you were going to operate in the SECA at all, then it has an ongoing cost. And for those ships who operate only in the SECA, of course, it was a competitive and potentially a cause of modal shift issue, and very difficult for those ship owners, and we fully understand that. I think if you then extend what happens in the rest of MARPOL Annex 6 and with the global sulfur cup coming in, we're going to see a much greater impact on ships. This ongoing cost is going to be much bigger, not only in terms of the different types of fuel that ships will effectively be mandated to use, but also the differential in price is huge. And who knows what is going to happen to that differential in the future. So very, very difficult. I think the thing that irritates me, and I'm just thinking back to your mention of the Baltic, is thinking about other regulation. There is discussion about reducing the discharge of sewage into the Baltic from passenger ships. And, that's a laudable intention. We look at it and we say, okay, this is sensible. Let's reduce the impact of these ships. But actually, when you compare that impact to the other sources of those nutrients into the Baltic Sea, and you realize how tiny the shipping contribution is, then you start to understand that actually we are an industry that is open to regulation, and therefore we tend to accept it. But the other impacts, the land runoff from agriculture, for example, the discharge of sewage from towns, is not regulated in the same way, and therefore we bear a disproportionate proportion of the costs associated with trying to do this. But actually, the impact of removing shipping sewage on the Baltic will probably be so small it won't even be measurable.
But that goes to visibility and the press, because it's easy to make a case out of showing how the big cruise vessels are releasing sewage into the water.
Well, isn't it interesting that you've picked up on the visibility of the industry, because we always say the industry is not visible. And I think you're making a really good point, because what penalises us is that we're only visible when there is something wrong. And politicians then will pick up on this, and inevitably, when the politician becomes interested, ultimately we end up with a new regulation. But one of the things that we do try to do is we are trying to increase the visibility of the industry. It's an uphill battle, and in some respects, maybe it isn't a battle that we should be fighting, because it's quite nice for the ship owner to carry on with his business, to be completely efficient, deliver his cargo safely into time, and not have that in the public domain. But on the other hand, I always try to argue with them that if only we can increase the political standing of the industry, then when push comes to shove and we're trying to argue a case, and the politician understands that we are doing this massively important job without which the world will stop, then they might start to think twice about what it is, the new cost or the new requirement they're imposing on the industry.
And it also goes to showing young people that there is a very cool industry I could work in. But if we don't show, no one will know.
I think there's a real dilemma here. You know, when I went to sea, I had a passion to go to sea. I wanted to do nothing else. And when people tried to dissuade me, I wasn't listening. That was what I had to do. But now I think life has changed. I'm sure there are young people out there who do have that same passion. And you're right, we need to increase the visibility of the industry to show that it is pretty much as high-tech as the aviation industry. The responsibility that a watchkeeper bears on the bridge of a merchant ship, or indeed in the engine room of a merchant ship, with all of that technology, with all of the value of the ship and the people on board and the value of the cargo and the importance of delivering it to time, then this is actually very exciting, but somehow we fail to get that message across. On the other hand, I think the industry has got a task to do, and that is to change the way of life at sea in some way, and I don't know what the answer is, but to make it more attractive. You know, we have to do, some of the answers I think are clear. We have to give modern youth connectivity. I think that's really important. And I think that message is getting across now. But when you have a very large ship with very few people on board and very little socialization, then it becomes unattractive to young people. So these are things that we have to solve. You know, for me in the Navy, it was very easy because we had ships with lots of people on board, so there was no escaping other people, even sometimes when you wanted to escape. But I think to ask a young person to go on board a merchant ship now and really not to socialize for several weeks or maybe months is just not going to suit their lifestyle. So we have to find solutions to this. You know, we need to think very carefully, and we need to invest in something to address that problem.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. I think connectivity on board, and also to show by digital means the young generation that there is something here that you're missing out. I think that's the way forward. I've given it a lot of thought. Before I started the podcast, I was thinking about it, of course, because I also share your passion for the industry and I want more people to know about it. And I can tell you that since I started the podcast, I get approached by so many people outside shipping. We tend to speak to each other within our own groups. And by doing that, no one else would find out about us.
Well, I think you're onto a really good thing, and I think your podcast is obviously having a good effect. I always say to people at conferences, when I see a group of shipping people in a circle moaning about the industry, I say to them, why don't you turn round, think about the good things and start broadcasting this? Even if it's only to your family, you're going to make a difference. And particularly, you know, when we talk to, for example, the students at the World Maritime University, they are the people who can really get across to the right age group what makes them excited about the industry. And I always find them to be a particularly motivated group. And they have this opportunity to get the message out in all these different countries around the world. And it's that kind of messaging that I think we should be using. This is about, it's kind of physical crowdsourcing we need to be using.
Yeah, and I say the same thing to people when they have trainees, which goes to shipbuilding nations. I tell them, you are giving this young person such a wonderful experience and education. Maybe you should put a demand on them to start a blog or to share what they see in their own social media network, because then someone will see the cool things that they are seeing on site. But I haven't been successful because I think people who is deciding about the trainee doesn't really have the same insights on digital communication that I have.
Well, I think you're in a very good place, but let me ask you a question then. Yeah. Do you think that the digital media is reaching a plateau? I mean, I look at Twitter, I look at Facebook, I look at LinkedIn, and actually I don't have time to read all this stuff. And so I wonder how much is actually being lost and whether we've reached a point where we have to do something different and we've actually saturated this medium.
I think you're right. I don't find the time either. And it's important because social media is supposed to be a dialogue, but it's used more like one direction communication, a megaphone. When I spoke to Jonathan Wichmann, who started all this social media for Maersk Line, he said, you should consider social media being like a dinner conversation. So you have to answer who's talking to you, and you have to think about who you are talking to, and you shouldn't exclude anyone, and so on. But I also think the forerunners, they start with the new tools all the time. And now Facebook and Twitter and those social media, they have matured in a way, and they are changing their algorithms. So it isn't as exciting as it was in the beginning. And that has an effect on us using them. But I mean, they are big listed companies, so of course they want to have as much as they can out of their business.
Yeah, and they should. I think companies need to look at all these mechanisms, but I do think that the novelty has worn off. And what I was really talking about was not so much these sort of formulaic methods of communication, but I think we need to give young people at sea genuine connectivity. So Skype and maybe even just a mobile phone. And if they require satellite communication to deliver the mobile phone, then to give them the opportunity to speak to their friends and family, I think is really important.
I agree. But I also think that when I started the podcast, I realized that everyone is telling the bad stories because journalists, that's their job. They won't write something about a building that is not on fire. They are that write about a building on fire. If no one is telling the good story about shipping, we can do that ourselves. So we can be in command of what we broadcast to the outer world. But no one is doing that. Not for the entire industry. That's my view anyhow.
Yeah, you're right. We've tried a couple of times. For example, a few years ago, we produced a DVD, which was about, I wasn't involved in the production of that, but it had in it some of the things that I think are really exciting. You have to have pictures of ships at sea in heavy weather or going fast, taken from a helicopter. So you see the drama of it. You need a picture of the bridge with the windows covered in water and the windscreen wipers going. These are exciting things, and they will actually inspire people to think about this career. We have to do this. You cannot expect the journalists to do this because they will not sell newspapers. We're not after selling something. We need to be pushing something out. So we do need to do more work on that. But I think the daunting thing is you need a lot of money to finance this kind of PR approach. And we have talked to, as an organisation, ICS has talked to campaign companies, political campaign companies. And the problem is the money they want is just astronomical. And then you always have at the back of your mind, if we spend all this money on this campaign, and right at the end of the campaign we have one accident which hits the headlines, then probably a lot of that money has been wasted. So you really have to balance a lot of things, and we really need somebody with a lot of money to come along and say, okay, I'm prepared to take the risk. Let's discuss how we can promote this industry.
Yeah, I think you're right and you're wrong. It's like,
I don't mind being wrong.
No, but we don't just need a campaign. We need the everyday information as well. Small things, but everyday, reminding people that there is a shipping industry. So the campaign could be the big thing, but you need to get this everyday thing out. Look upon other industries. What are they doing and how do they do it?
Well, I think, again, you're raising an interesting question. First of all, I think a campaign is all-encompassing. So it's so sure there are the big things, like maybe it's a DVD or maybe it's a some advert you put on at the cinema or on television, but also down in the weeds, it's also the daily messaging. But how you do that, I'm not quite so sure. But then you talked about what do other industries do. And a lot of people, when you have this conversation with a lot of people, they say, oh, but the electricity industry does not worry about whether people know what happens when you flick the light switch. And to a certain extent, shipping is the same. You know, when you buy your new fridge or your new television, you don't need to know how it got there. As a consumer, we as the industry, we would love them to know, yes, this could only come by sea. And if it wasn't for ships, I wouldn't be able to have this. I wouldn't be able to live my life to the expectations I've now got. And we need to think about that balance.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. I was thinking back to when Jonathan told me that Maersk didn't have any reason to believe what happened for them. People started to take photos of containers with Maersk on it and send it to them, post it under the hashtag. And all of a sudden they got photos from all over the world and they didn't really expect that. So that helped them.
Do you know, when piracy was setting off back in 2007, 2008, I tried to persuade some container companies to put posters on the side of their containers, which the messages could be various, but they could be, you know, I live 90% of my life at sea. This is the container itself. Or it could be, on my way here, I encountered piracy in the Indian Ocean. You know, those sort of things. And the reason it's so powerful on containers is because that is the only element of the shipping industry which you actually see on the road in every country in the world. So they have got this fantastic messaging medium, and I don't think we're using it, and nobody would take me up on the piracy thing. I still think it would be a worthwhile thing to do, just to get that message out.
Have you seen the guy, the artist that is actually using containers to build faces?
No.
I will show you to you.
Okay, I look forward to that.
The
other avenue you started to open up was, you mentioned what do other industries do, and I think the industry that we really ought to look towards in terms of messaging is aviation. So they have a number of advantages. They're seen by everybody. They're used by, I would say, the majority of the world's population, but many, many people in the world are using aeroplanes. They've only got to look up and they'll see an aeroplane, wherever in the world they are. And so therefore, that industry has an amazing visibility in the public eye, which we don't have except for these containers. So I think there's an area there we need to think about very carefully. But also, whenever you see a picture of an aircraft, certainly in an advertising or PR sense, it's always blue sky, fluffy white clouds, brilliantly polished aircraft, looking wonderful. And it just makes you excited because you're thinking, yeah, I could be going on holiday in that. And so they have this massive advantage. But I really think there are PR opportunities that we're not exploiting in terms of giving shipping an image and making use of the exciting images we actually do have.
And we need our spokespersons. We need our heroes to carry that for us. I
think, yeah, people often quote how easy it is for aviation to have these ambassadors, and Richard Branson comes to mind. But of course, he's not just a public figure because of aviation. He's a public figure because of all of his other business interests and the fact that he's not afraid for his views to be broadcast. We don't have that kind of personality in shipping. We don't tend to have people who have got fingers in many other industries. We tend to be quite, as a rule, we are quite bound by shipping. That's a shame. There is quite a lot of diversification, but it tends not to be in other industries which have this public image. But
he's coming into cruising.
Well, that will help us. That will help us. You know, if he's prepared to be pro-shipping. I think for a time when he was working more exclusively in aviation and was with the Carbon War Room, he tended to be a bit anti-shipping. And I remember I had a conversation with him a few years ago when Carbon War Room was first trying to give this message that aviation was so much more efficient than shipping. And I had a conversation with him and I said, do you really understand how efficient shipping is? Do you understand how much cargo we carry? Do you understand the relative positions of the two industries in terms of cargo carried? And he admitted he didn't. He said, oh, nobody's ever told me this stuff before. So I think he was very cleverly briefed to give the right message at that particular time. Maybe with him coming into shipping, we can actually use him to advantage. And we should
We
shouldn't be shy of that. We should use any advantage we can find.
Because, cruise might be the most relevant compared to aviation. Because you actually get your consumer on board there as well. And you can easily show things.
I think that's right. And after all, when I think about it, you don't see adverts for cargo aircraft. You only see adverts for passenger aircraft. But there's probably as many aircraft in the world carrying cargo as there are passenger aircraft. So maybe there is some balance we need to achieve there.
So what are the biggest issues right now? What's on your desk now?
I think the most important and the one with the longest term impact is all the work that's going on in terms of climate change. I think it is poorly understood outside the industry just how much has already been done, not only by individual companies in terms of making the ships more efficient, reducing their fuel bills, carrying more cargo for less fuel, but also the regulatory aspects, the imposition of the Energy Efficiency Design Index and the management plan for efficiency have been remarkably effective tools, and we are already on a trajectory of reducing emissions on a ton of cargo carried per mile travel. I'm very happy about that. I'm very confident we're going in the right direction. But of course, the outcome of the Paris Agreement in particular means that the industry is under pressure to reduce its overall emissions. And that is a huge battle. When you're faced with growth in demand for maritime transport, which means you have to have more capacity, which means that you have to have more ships, which means that you have to produce more emissions. So we have to find a way through this, and it's an extremely complex problem. It's an issue where we are trying so very hard to get a consensus across the industry as to how we should move forward. And we're not there yet. And I think we're losing out politically because aviation has made it very clear. They have got a clear objective for carbon neutral growth. They have set some timelines for that. It's much easier for aviation because the bulk of the membership of the equivalent organisation to ICS in aviation is mostly national companies, whereas we're dealing with national associations with a whole range of national companies under their own membership. So it's much harder for us to get a consensus. But I think politically we're being damaged in this industry because we're not clear in public as to what our message is. I am very clear in my own mind that this industry is totally focused on achieving the maximum possible level of efficiency. And I'm sure that's the direction that we're going in. But I don't have a mandate to say that to the politicians. And that is a serious problem for us at the moment. I think it would be terrible for us to get into a political discussion where there is a clear comparison between the will of aviation to deliver and the apparent superficial reluctance of shipping to make the same delivery. And we have to sort that message out.
So how do you work with the EU, with Brussels on this? Do you cooperate, or is it... Because I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Brian Simpson last week, Motorways of the Sea.
Yes. I would say liaise is a better word than cooperate. So we play a sort of cat and mouse game because we are trying to find out what is it the Commission is working towards in the long-term future. We think we know, but they won't admit that. And in the same time, they're trying to find out what can we do and can they use the industry to serve their political objectives. But that is not the way that business should be done. We should have a very clear picture of what the political objectives are, and we should understand for long-term planning purposes exactly what is the requirement that's going to be placed on the industry. But that, of course, is what Europe thinks, and I don't work solely in the European context. That's the role of the European Community Shipowners Associations. What we are doing is we're working at the international level, and within that international level, Europe has a very strong voice and is making powerful messages about where they think shipping should be in relation to the Paris Agreement. But that is not a view that is shared largely outside Europe. It is a view shared by some countries. I think America has a similar objective, but sees a different way of getting there. So there's not really alignment between Europe and the US. Some of the other if you like, green thinking countries like Australia, for example, I think they can see what Europe is trying to do. They're probably not too far away in their thinking. But when you look at Asia, when you look at South America, the objectives there of politicians are completely different. And it's not just an issue of developing and developed countries. It's an issue which is more subtle than that, more regionally based. And in these discussions at IMO, it is fascinating to watch these different countries manoeuvring, to watch new groupings form between different countries on a particular issue. But it doesn't solve my problem, because what I want to do is be able to go back to the industry and say, look, it's really clear the IMO is going to do X, Y, and Z, and the timelines are 2020, 2030, 2050. So let's do what I started out explaining. Let's do an exercise where we know what the objective is, and we can then look at how we're going to deliver on that objective in the most cost-effective and least disruptive way. But we can't do that at the moment because the politicians are playing it very close to their chest. And we are not yet in a consensus position to be able to deliver on our thoughts properly. I think we've done a lot. We've moved a long way. I think the paper that ICS put into the last environment meeting at the IMO was, I think, constructive, certainly been well received by a lot of governments. I've had a lot of good comments from governments saying, yes, we can see what you're trying to do. And basically the message was, we think the IMO needs to listen very carefully to what the Paris Agreement said. It needs to align its language with the language in the Paris Agreement, and it needs to understand that what shipping delivers cannot be at the same level as all of the developed countries have agreed to under the Paris Agreement. What Paris did was it allowed each individual country to decide what it could do itself without being constrained by what other countries were doing. So they could set their own timeline, they could set their own objectives. Many of them talk about carbon neutral growth. But there's an aspiration in Europe for shipping to be delivering at the same level as European countries. But 50% of what shipping does is for developing countries. And if we go to that extreme, then we would disadvantage the developing countries. And that is not what shipping's about. So we need to find some medium level where we're somewhere in between what developed and developing countries have promised to deliver.
Who's going to pay for the technical leap?
Well, there's only one answer to that. The ship owner always pays. It doesn't matter what the regulation is. The ship owner pays. So the principle that we try to uphold is that the pain should be equal for everybody. I think if you level the playing field by keeping the cost the same, no matter how unwelcome those costs are, ship owners are prepared to say, okay, as long as all my competitors are bearing the same costs, then we'll deal with it. I think it's a shame that ship owners are not so well empowered to pass costs on. And I think we need to think about that in the longer term. But I guess that the cost of innovation is something that is inescapable. At the end of the day, the innovation will help the owner to have a ship that costs less to run. And so long as the balance works out, that at the end of the day, he's made more money at the end of 30 years of running this ship by having a ship that was more efficient and using less fuel and carrying more cargo, then at the end of the day, so be it. What is appalling is if we reach a situation where the commercial side simply doesn't stack up and it's going to cost you more to buy this new ship than you're ever going to recover, then you have problems with finance and the industry is just not going to work. It's just going to become a nightmare. Mm. And so this is why the political aspirations are so difficult to deal with, because the politicians are not interested, so far anyway, in the availability of new technology, whether it's widely available, what is the impact on the overall cost of the industry, just what does that cost mean to the individual owner. And this is an area where perhaps we can also add flavour to the political debate, because perhaps we haven't done enough of that. Another hobby horse of mine is that I think the shipyards are not helping us very much at the moment. They are being very reluctant, for their own commercial reasons, to tell us what they can deliver in terms of innovation and efficiency. And when you talk to them, you almost get the impression that they've got nothing else to deliver. Now, I'm a great believer that when there is a problem, human ingenuity will solve it. And so I think once it is known that we need to deliver more and more efficient ships, then somebody will come up with something. Who knows, in 10, 15, 20 years' time, we might be using a fuel we haven't even thought of right now. We might be having a hull form that we've never seen before. And all of these things are possible, but everything comes down to money, as you've already said. Somebody's got to invest in this. Somebody is going to have to bite the bullet and invest in this technology and try to persuade clever designers to come up with something new. But at the moment, the shipyards simply don't seem to have any bright ideas to talk to us about.
Yeah, but that is also, I think, some kind of misconception. I don't think politicians or the public knows that you don't buy a ship as you buy a lorry. Because if you buy a lorry or a truck, the truck company is developing the technical things. And there are so many things that has happened. And sometimes we get compared to, an engine in a truck, how far they have reached when it comes to emissions and things like that. Yeah, but that is one truck company competing with another global truck company on the technical development side. But in shipping, every ship owner orders his own series, if that is 3 or 20 vessels. And he decides what they should look like because he has got the technical knowledge and he orders that from the shipyard. So it's not the same for every ship. And I don't think that the public realizes that.
Yeah, I think there's a perception that you just go to a shipyard and you buy a ship. And of course, people don't know that it's probably 3 years from drawing board to delivery. They don't understand that you want to run this ship for at least 25 years. And it's this timescale, the length of the timescale that is not widely understood. We try to get that across to politicians. I think the IMO, I'm confident the IMO member states understand this. I'm not quite so confident in other regional contexts that it is widely understood. But we need to inject this long-term thinking. That is something we have very firmly in mind when we're negotiating on regulation, because we try to build that in. We try to protect two areas, really. We try to protect the existing ships, and we'll always fight for what we call a grandfathering arrangement. So if you have a ship that's only got, say, 10 years of commercial life left, you shouldn't have to carry some new piece of equipment that really isn't cost effective to fit. The other area, which is even more important, is we need to protect those ship owners who are prepared to put their money where their mouth is and go out and be what we call an early mover. And we are fighting this particularly over the Ballast Water Convention at the moment, where there are quite a number of ships which have been fitted with first generation ballast water treatment equipment, a lot of which is having serious problems. And we are fighting very hard to make sure that those ships do not need to change out that equipment, because the owner bought cutting edge equipment in good faith from a manufacturer, believing it would work. And after all of the equipment that's been fitted has been type approved by the administration. So therefore, it is grossly inadequate for the regulator then to say, okay, well, we all made a mistake and you're going to pay for it and you're going to have to change to new equipment. So that is a battle we're fighting very hard at the moment. And it applies in other areas of regulation as well.
So you don't want the Ballast Water Convention to be ratified yet?
The text of the convention was drafted and adopted in 2004, so already 12 years ago. And just as an aside, it was actually signed and adopted on the Friday the 13th of February 2004, so it got off to a bad start. But I think we knew at the time, ICS made a statement that very day to say, look, there are a number of areas where this is going to be problematic. It's very aspirational. We don't think the equipment is available. We're not sure that the technology to deliver on to the required standard is actually developed yet. And we think there's going to be a massive cost on the industry. And the IMO noted that intervention. And I think if the convention had been ratified in 2006, 7, 8, when we had some very clear dates for actually a well-structured entry into force that was phased, so certain ships in certain years had to have the equipment, then I think what would have happened is those ships would have fitted the equipment and we would have started to discover very quickly the problems. There would have been a problem over availability of equipment. we would have discovered very quickly that the equipment wasn't working properly. We would have discovered the fact that much of this equipment would not work across the operating range of the ship in terms of seawater salinity or temperature and so on. And I think then we would have been in a good position to amend the convention as we went along. That would have been a smoother issue. And in fact, in the very early days, ICS did what it always does, is it recommends that governments should ratify the convention as quickly as possible to remove any doubt from the industry. But of course, governments shared the concerns that we had, and therefore there was a real reluctance by many, many governments to ratify this convention because they understood quite starkly what the impact was going to be on the industry. And so therefore ICS, after 3 or 4 years, ICS had to change its position and say we can no longer recommend ratification. For one reason, this very carefully staged entry into force regime had already passed. The years were already historic and they had not been applied because the convention wasn't enforceable. And we had to look at how other mechanisms for smoothing the entry into force. So do I want the convention to enter into force right now? I prefer it didn't, because I think it's going to be a massive challenge, despite the fact we have got a 5-year entry into force linked to the dry docking cycle. That's helpful. I still think that given the fact that around about 50,000 ships are going to have to buy equipment over 5 years, I don't think the equipment's going to be on the shelf. We have this terrible, terrible problem imposed by the United States with its own national regulation. But it's not just the fact they've imposed this national regulation, it's the fact that they haven't actually managed to approve a single piece of ballast water treatment equipment. And more than that, they have clearly indicated that they do not think that ultraviolet equipment will work. And around about 50% of the equipments that have already been fitted worldwide are UV. So those people know already that it's unlikely that the US Coast Guard will allow, or the EPA will allow those equipments to be used in US waters. So a lot of owners, quite rightly in my view, they're being forced to sit back and wait for the US to type approve some equipment. And when they do that, then that will be where owners will be buying, inevitably, because if it is okay for the US, it's going to be okay for the rest of the world. In the meantime, I think the IMO is playing a good game of catch-up. There is a lot of work going on. We're heavily involved in the Ballast Water Working Group, which is going on all the time, looking at how to make the type approval guidelines more robust. And in fact, we don't want them to be guidelines, we want them to be mandatory, which is a battle we may not win, but at least we are winning in terms of making the type approval more robust. So in the future, when these new guidelines are in force, the owner will be able to go to the manufacturer and he will know what temperature range it works in. He will know whether or not it is suitable for the US. So he'll be in a better position. So it will be really useful for the convention not to come into force right now because I think there are too many unknowns. But the IMO will be very unhappy to hear me say that. But I think that the ship owner is in an absolutely impossible situation. And the worst case is if the international convention comes into force before the United States has got type approval for at least 1 or 2 or 3 equipments. Because what does he do? He will have to gamble on what he buys being suitable in the States, and that may not be the case.
Going back to the lorry industry, it's easier.
Absolutely.
We need to talk about digitalization and cybersecurity. I think that is on your table as well at the moment.
Yeah, actually, ICS doesn't lead on this. It's led by BIMCO. So we're party to discussion with BIMCO. We were instrumental in doing a lot of redrafting of the guide that we then collectively pushed out with a lot of other industry associations. And the objective of that guidance is to really, rather than to solve the problem, it's to alert people to the problem. And I think then it's really down to individual companies, having been alerted to the fact that they may be at risk for some kind of cyber attack, or indeed at a time when the use of technology is increasing, that actually even the failure of some of their technology, regardless of some ill-intentioned hacker, could have a major impact on their business. So companies need to develop their reactive plans as to how they're going to deal with these problems. So I think we've done what we needed to do in terms of alertment. Whether we produce more guidance in the future is difficult to say. I think I get the impression, and I'm not an expert on cyber at all, but I get the impression that the solutions are likely to be quite individual to individual companies. So it's difficult to produce guidance. So whereas my instinct normally is to produce a book which will help companies, if we can do a lot of the groundwork for all of the companies in the world and they can just pick it up and run with it, then I think we've done the service that we're paid to do. In the case of cyber, I suspect companies need to look at individual solutions, so it may not be appropriate for us to produce anything else.
But we're all in this together, the cyber security thing. I can remember back when we were all approaching the millennium, with all the millennium clauses flying around. And in a way, we can't have one bad apple if we're doing business with someone who isn't thinking about cybersecurity if we're going forward.
Yeah, well, that's correct. But I think this is about awareness. And I think we have raised awareness by this joint publication. The thing is, people need to be aware that there's a problem. And I think 2 or 3 years ago, frankly, in shipping, there wasn't much attention being paid to it. I think there is a lot more attention being paid now. So I'm not at all nervous about that. I think we will continue to bang the drum to say you have to be aware that there is a potential problem here. What I'm really saying is I'm not sure we can do much more, because for us to produce something that's alleged to be, here is the manual on how you protect your company from any form of cyber attack or any form of IT failure, would be to mislead, because probably some of it it is not a one-size-fits-all solution. That's all I'm saying.
What is your views on the autonomous ships?
I'm not surprised that people are looking at autonomous ships, which I interpret as meaning unmanned ships. There are different levels to this, and maybe I'll come back to unmanned ships in a minute, but I'm very keen on going down solutions for ships where the watchkeepers are helped out by automation, self-monitoring of equipment, to a certain extent, decision-making of equipment. But when you start talking about reducing the manning to a very low level, then you come back to all the social problems which I mentioned before. But you also introduce another problem, and that is, what is the job satisfaction? If your only job in life is to sit on the ship and be woken by some alarm because the machine's decided it can no longer cope, I don't think there is any job satisfaction in that, and I think that creates a whole new problem. When we go down the route of unmanned ships, I think you open up a whole new set of real problems, and I can perfectly see that you can run a ferry across a small estuary. You can maybe run a ship in limited coastal waters with no people on board. I think that's already been proven. And I think there are some quite good military uses of autonomous ships. But I think when you start to think about large ships carrying vital cargoes, and you start to think about not having a person in the decision-making chain, then I think you are creating a problem. And I don't think this has been properly thought through. I think you can run a ship with nobody on board across an ocean, but it cannot do the first bit of the voyage, and it cannot do the last bit of the voyage into port without somebody being on board. And that's the real problem, because how do you guarantee you can get on board the people, the pilotage team, to do that final element of the voyage? If the weather's bad, if you can't fly the helicopter or they can't get on board from the pilot boat, you have huge problems, because you'll have ships steaming up and down the coast with nobody on board in bad weather, probably forming congestion, and it will not add to the efficiency of the industry. So that really worries me. But I tell you what worries me even more than that is a transition phase when we have a group of ships with nobody on board and the vast majority of ships which are manned. How do you manage the anti-collision rules, the rules of the road? I think that is a nightmare that the IMO is going to have to think about. I wish we didn't have to think about it, but I think we will have to think about it. And in fact, Again, this is a general message here. I think the IMO is okay at producing regulation which envisages an end state. It knows where the industry is today. It knows where it wants to be when the regulation is fully effective. What is never done effectively is the transition. We're going to see this with ballast water. We're going to see it with the global sulfur cap. We're going to see it with the efficiency in CO2 emissions. We never seem to be able to structure a proper, safe, cost-effective transition.
Why is that?
I think because largely it's not even considered. No matter how much we bang the table at the IMO and say, we have to get from here to there, so let's manage the process. Sometimes we get it. As I said before, under the ballast water, we got, under the original convention text, we had a very good phased transition. That was probably the first time that I can think of when we actually had such a good process. But it was completely annulled by the failure of countries to bring the convention into force at an early stage. So it was overtaken by events. And then we were in a catch-up phase of producing another solution, which ICS did by proposing that we aligned it with the dry docking certification. And that, that provides some kind of staging process, but it's not as clever as the original process was. So we have to get the IMO member states to understand that it's not just here and there, it is how do we actually get there? It's that process which is lacking.
Some people say that it might have something to do with the member states sending people with the entire portfolio of transport nowadays. So they had to look into both, the people representing the countries, look into both road and rail, aviation and maritime, which means they're not experts in maritime.
Yeah, and you asked me earlier on what change had I noticed, and the biggest change I've noticed in terms of the IMO is a complete fall-off in the number of experienced mariners representing governments in the IMO. When I first went there was a significant number of highly experienced ex-masters and chief engineers who were working on government delegations. What has happened in the last 15 years, which is the only bit I can speak about firsthand, is that governments have cut the costs of their delegations, they've reduced the size of their delegations, that they tend now to be much more political animals populating delegations. Many people do not have any experience of seafaring, so they don't have that intuitive thinking. When somebody is discussing a regulation, oh yes, I can see exactly how that's going to affect the people on board the ship. That is lacking from so many delegations now. And you're right, when we go to the environmental meetings, it tends to be people from environmental departments of government who go, rather than even the transport section. When you're at the Maritime Safety Committee, it tends to be the transport people. So there's a disconnect immediately, because there may not, within the individual government, be an understanding of how do we link what's happening in the Maritime Safety Committee to what is happening in the Marine Environment Protection Committee. So that is a problem. They don't have an in-depth understanding of the industry. And I guess that they have exactly the same problem when they're dealing with road or rail, that their mind is not 100% on the job.
Yeah, we have to fly the flag of shipping, don't we?
Well, you keep returning to that, and of course you're absolutely right. And we're trying to do that. But I'm really looking for a benevolent entrepreneur to help me out with some funding for this.
Thank you for taking the time to speak to me. Who do you think I should interview the next time?
Well, from the ICS perspective, I'd like you to talk to the ICS chairman, Espen Poulsen.
Done.
You've done it already?
Check.
Okay. Because I went through your list yesterday. And
it hasn't been released yet.
Oh, okay. Well, I did take the trouble to go through your list to see who was there. Who else should you talk to? What about Ki-Tak Lim, the IMO SG? What about in the European Commission, the DG Klima, I think would be very interesting to talk to them. DG Transport, DG Tren. But I think Klima would be the most interesting one there. US Coast Guard, Abel Thomas would be good news, or Jeff Lance. You're smiling because you've already done these.
No, I haven't. Thank you for all your good suggestions. I will see what I can do. Thank you. for your time.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and you've made me think on a number of issues, which is really interesting, stimulating.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. I really enjoyed talking to you. It's important to understand how the politics works and doesn't work. During the holiday season, I've been thinking a lot about the podcast. Of course, it's a new year and I've reached the 50th episode. That is, I've done 50 hours of interviews available. Not to mention all the work I've done. But I have come to the conclusion that it's a balance act to have interviews in pipeline and to have guests appearing 6 months later. Usually, if I travel to a conference, or more likely nowadays, go to a city and set up a lot of interviews, that means that since I only release new episodes every second week, there is a waiting period. Usually, the content in the podcast interviews is evergreen. I ask people about things that is not the news of the headlines, but in this case, I think I have to apologize because it was a little bit late. So I think I need to think about that when I now go to first Stockholm and then Copenhagen later this month. I think I'm going to fill up my bag of interviews until the summer. But we'll see. The next thing I've been thinking about is the theme song and the jingle. I'm not quite sure if I want to keep it or if I should try and make a new one. I like the theme song, but maybe you are up for something new. I don't know. Please send me an email and let me know what you think. It's hello@shippingpodcast.com. Well, I think that is all I want to share with you at the moment. Until the next time, from me to you, over and out. Thank you for listening to the Shipping Podcast. Don't forget to tell everyone that you meet that there is a shipping podcast where the maritime professionals are talking about their everyday job.